Welcome to week 5. This week we are talking about types of assessment. We are going to be focusing on formative and summative assessments. So in looking at assessments, there are many types. We have diagnostic, formative, project-based, summative, portfolio-based, alternative, and benchmark assessments, just to name some of the more popular types of assessments that we see out there and that we're using in K-12 education. We're going to focus, as I said, on two types of assessments, formative and summative, and ding ding, as you can see, it's kind of a boxing match between the two. One looks at the assessment of learning, while the other looks at the assessment for learning. So exactly what is a summative assessment? When you have a summative assessment, it kind of moves in a cycle. You plan, you implement, you assess, you revise based on what your students have gained, and you go through the process again and again. So summative assessments attempt to sum up the student's achievement and knowledge. They want to determine in one setting what the student knows. This is an assessment of learning. The other type of assessment we're going to talk about is formative assessment. Formative assessment involves gathering information based on the student's performance. What the student's goal is, you're using information to reach that goal. This is known as assessment for learning. So you look at where am I going, how do I close the gap, and where am I now in order to use formative assessment with your students. The difference again between formative and summative assessment, after a summative assessment, you stop. After conducting a formative assessment, it leads you on the road to continual improvement for each and every student in the classroom. Here are just some cute comic strips that I found. I'm not going to read these to you, but I'll leave them up on the screen for a minute for you to look through those. Again, these comics do kind of ring true, and in looking at this one, we have the little dog on the bottom, and he says, I'm going to need more specific feedback on my formative assessment. The teacher has given him an assessment of bad dog. So, formative assessments allow the teacher to see what the student knows and teach what the student needs. This video that I'm hoping that's going to play, oh, no, it's not. I'll just load it in there for you. Talks about formative versus summative assessment. So there are many ways to assess students. What are some examples? You're going to be answering this question for me this week in the forum. We're also going to kind of talk about grading versus assessment. What is the difference between grading and assessment? It says go ahead and get started. What are some examples of grading? What are some examples of assessment? Just think about those to yourself. And on the next slide, I'm going to give you some answers to these questions. Grading, assessment. What are they? How are they alike? How are they different? So in looking at how they are different, grading, generally the goal here is to evaluate the individual student's learning and performance. Grades are sometimes treated as a proxy for student learning, and they're not always a reliable measure. On the other hand, the goal of the assessment is to improve the student learning. Although grading can play a role in assessment, assessment involves many ungraded measures of student learning. In looking at grading and assessment, it kind of ties into what we've talked about so far with Bloom's taxonomy. This example here is many different types of technology applications in which you can use with students in order to increase both formative and summative assessments based on which activity you would pick. I like this. I think it's really helpful. If this were a technology class, we'd be using many of these. If you have any questions about anything that you see in this triangle, please feel free to ask me. Moving on, again, looking at Bloom's taxonomy. Here are some key words that fall under each of the 6 categories displayed. And remember, when working with assessment, these can come in handy. We have talked about Bloom's previously in the class. And then finally, looking at the multiple intelligences, again, these also play a role in assessment. That's the end of the PowerPoint for this week. Students, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, stephanie.duffy-zimmer@westliberty.edu.